Yesterday saw the launch of the RTX 4070 Super, a GPU that improves upon the RTX 4070 with a higher core count and set of specs in every way possible. More CUDA cores, and more RT cores, more Tensor cores, and with it a big focus on AI upscaling, or DLSS. Now, our general consensus was that it's good, but it does have a fight on its hands from AMD in the way of the 7800 XT. Though NVIDIA do win in terms of those extra glorious frames when it comes to DLSS, namely with frame generation. So with a launch price of $599, it already had a battle in the bang for buck world, whereas today sees the launch of the non-MSRP cards that should provide better cooling, higher boost clocks, and all-round better quality. And with two cards on hand, we're going to see if paying even more is worth it overall. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So let's jump straight into the cards, because by now we all know what the RTX 4070 Super is all about as far as a GPU goes. And while we had 4 models on offer, they all came in with the same $599 MSRP launch price. And for the most part, were very similar, though some had better coolers, while others had better clock speeds. So with the ASUS TUF Gaming OC and Gigabyte Gaming OC in our midst, I want to know if the extra cost involved in having one can improve upon the 4070 Super GPU. So starting with the ASUS card. As we would expect from a TUF product, you get their more premium Axial Tech fans, which can deliver more airflow and lower noise. There's 20k military grade capacitors, which are rated for up to 105 degrees C, and a boost clock of 2475 MHz in default mode and 2505 MHz in OC mode, so slightly higher than the MSRP cards. Most of all though, I'm expecting the more robust power delivery hardware and the larger cooler to be, I guess, what makes this card perform at its best. Now, first of all, I'm going to say this is a stunning looking piece of gaming hardware, albeit it does look kind of like all of the other previous TUF Gaming cards, but I guess if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Now this is, I guess, a pretty significantly sized cooler too, so taming the RTX 4070 Super core should be a breeze, as this cooler looks like it's lifted from a higher model in the RTX range. The cooler features 3 large and powerful axial fans, which come with lots of wide and slightly overlapping fins, as well as a trim around the edges that joins the fins together. This design helps prevent air from being pushed sideways from the fan and instead kind of points more directly down through the GPU heatsink. Unlike some of the more affordable RTX 4070 Super cards, this one features an all-metal shroud as well, which I've got to admit looks gorgeous with its gunmetal finish. It is also quite thick too, coming in at 3 slots, and is certainly longer and thicker than a lot of the MSRP cards. But again, that increased surface area of the cooler and more fans is going to help it hit the higher boost clocks and maintain them more easily, which should, in turn, mean higher FPS overall. Now tucked into the side you'll find the usual 12VH PWR connector, meaning it only needs a single power plug. However, there is quite a large void in that back section too, just enough to get my little finger in. Not that I think it needs more heatsink, but I guess it would have been nice to see all of the available space used as well. The backplate is made from a single piece of metal and comes with this cool digital artwork printed onto it, as well as a large section of ventilation towards the back of the card, allowing more heat to be exhausted away more easily. At the back you'll find 3 display ports and 1 HDMI connection, the same as seen on the Founders Edition of the RTX 4070 Super and the other MSRP cards. Now with the PCB torn down, the PCB looks surprisingly clean and tidy. There are 6 memory ICs, each one being 2GB and gives us the 12GB of VRAM in total. All of the capacitors and chokes on the VRM have been upgraded to premium grade hardware, such as those 20k 105C rated capacitors, which are much more durable and reliable than the ones seen on the MSRP cards. There's even more on the back of the PCB too, which I haven't actually seen on any other RTX 4070 Super yet, so the overall power delivery and power conditioning is certainly upgraded here. The heatsink is large with 6 massive heat pipes running through the largest section of it, and 3 more through the block directly above the GPU. There are good quality thermal pads deployed on the memory ICs, as well as each bank of capacitors, ensuring all major components are directly cooled. The fans are all mounted onto the single piece shroud, which is plastic on the inside, but it has that metal skin on the exterior. And then the fans themselves are all screwed into flexible mounts with anti-vibration pads on the back to prevent vibrations against the heatsink. So I think we can all agree it's a pretty decent looking card, and once broken down you can tell it does mean business. So I guess on the cooling and acoustic side, I am actually expecting good things from the ASUS TUF Gaming OC. But what about the other card we have here, the Gigabyte Gaming OC? Well, being part of the Gigabyte Gaming series, you get ultra durable certified metal chokes, lower ESR solid capacitors, a 2-ounce copper PCB, and, much like the ASUS, a more robust set of MOSFETs. Now, these things aren't, I guess, uncommon on higher spec graphics cards from other brands, but it's still great to see an attention to detail that will ensure, firstly, reliability, and secondly, performance, especially when the card is being hammered and getting warm after those long gaming sessions. The addition of the bigger cooler will certainly help too, and while the design is largely unchanged, we know the Windforce cooler to be a reliable platform. Now, as you might expect, the Windforce cooler is the one that we know and love. We've said it time and time again in our videos. And while the general length and width changes, the design philosophy is very much what we expect from this iconic cooler that's been going for many, many years. Now, what I have noticed though is that the 11 blade fans with their thinner fins aren't present. Instead, Gigabyte are using a wider fin 9 blade design, which should allow for a lot of air pressure at a lower RPM. Now, Gigabyte hasn't changed the X3 configuration though, as the middle fan still spins the other way to the outside fans, creating a big air vortex in the heatsink to improve heat dissipation, and all of the fans are individually PWM controlled with 0 RPM modes, so it seems to tick all of the right boxes. Now, we'll admit the card is a little bit thicker, pushing to a triple slot design compared to most of the MSRP cards that were all pretty much dual slot designs. This means there's a much thicker heatsink in this card and bigger fans, allowing the card to run a bigger overclock and to deliver more cooling performance at the same time. There's the usual 12V PWR connector on the side of the card too, which I rather like as it's one cable versus the 2 or even 3 8-pin connectors that we saw on previous generations. There's also a BIOS switch, allowing you to switch between OC and silent modes, which are also handy should something go wrong flashing the BIOS, as you can simply recover the GPU using the alternative BIOS. There's a huge backplate on here too, which will help protect the PCB, keep the card from sagging, and also provide additional cooling to the back of the card. Plus, there's a massive cutout to allow the rearmost fan to push air through the card, which is exactly where the heatsink is the thickest and most dense. So again, this should help immensely with cooling performance. Now, towards the back, you'll find 3 display ports and a single HDMI port, so nothing out of the ordinary based on what we've seen before on other 4070 Super cards. Now, with the cooler stripped down, the PCB is pretty densely packed, and there's clearly more going on with the VRM, with more phases and chokes versus the Founders Edition card, nodding to the bigger overclock and the need for a more robust cooling solution. There's a typical 6 2GB VRAM ICs here, giving the card its 12GB total VRAM, which is, I guess, kind of a minimum in 2024. I know there was a lot of complaints last year when cards were coming out with 8GB or sometimes even less. Now, the back of the card is pretty neat and tidy, as Gigabyte uses a fully automated process that ensures there are no sharp points on the solder. The backplate is also a single piece construction that uses a screw-through design to sandwich the PCB without putting undue stress on the board, and it should actually help to dissipate heat that sits in this area as well. Now, I will admit, I love this heatsink. It's absolutely packed with things while also being a little thicker and wider than most in its class, giving it an increased surface area. And as you can see, there are thermal pads for all of the memory ICs, including 2 for the empty slots, suggesting that they use the same block on the 16GB Ti versions that are coming a little bit later on. It wouldn't surprise me. Now, there are pads for all of the phases and VRM hardware too, so everything is directly cooled and fed into the copper plate and the 6 massive heat pipes. So again, another great looking card. Now, these are still 4070 Supers at the heart of it, so really we need to find and make sure that they are working as they should. Where we've already tested 4 MSRP based 4070 Supers, we already have somewhat of a baseline figure, so we know where these should be performing. Obviously they are slightly overclocked, so maybe we're expecting a little bit more performance, but there are so many variables at play there. Now, when it comes to testing different models of the same GPU, we don't bother running it through the same amount of tests because some models are so close in performance to each other that we wouldn't really be showing too much. Instead, we run it in a small smattering of games to kind of make sure that the figures are where we expect them to be, based on a baseline from our initial launch day review. where in this case we use the RTX 4070 Super Founders card from NVIDIA. So for this, we booted up 6 different games at 1440p, which is kind of where the 4070 Super is actually targeted at, to see if both the ASUS and the Gigabyte gave us any extra performance. So starting with Baldur's Gate 3, where our performance on the FE card was already at 126 FPS, but the ASUS came in 5% faster at 132 FPS, and the Gigabyte Gaming OC at 134 FPS, making it about 6% faster. So some fairly strong gains over a reference spec. This also puts both cards slightly above the 3080 Ti and edging closer to the performance of the 4070 Ti. Booting up Call of Duty, where our baseline was set at 130 FPS, the ASUS didn't really offer much in extra performance at 131 FPS, so definitely within margin of error, while the Gigabyte card did improve on that a little more at 133, so still within the same margin of error, but slightly higher with a 2% improvement overall. In Cyberpunk, our FE scores an impressive 83 frames per second, and again ASUS came in just a single FPS higher, so a 1% margin. But if we were to test again, we could see the FE increase by a frame, and the ASUS TUF Gaming drop by a frame, so pretty matched performance overall. Again, Gigabyte did come out on top at 86 FPS, which is a 4% lead over the Founders card, but we, I guess, generally consider anything under around 5% to be within a marginal difference, and would typically call it as the same performance, plus or minus. Moving on to Spider-Man, and 181 FPS was the number to beat, and both of them did, with the ASUS coming in at 184 FPS and the Gigabyte at 188, so about 2% and 4% respectively. So again, Gigabyte is the faster of the two, but in terms of real-world gameplay, it's not anything you'd notice anyway. In Ratchet and Clank at 1440p, the 4070 Super comes in with performance at 124 FPS, with the ASUS just ahead by 2% at 127 FPS, and the Gigabyte ahead again further than that at 129 frames per second, putting it 4% ahead of the FE. Then lastly, in Starfield, we see our biggest gains from the 85 FPS that the FE gave us to 93 FPS on the Gigabyte, which is a 9% increase, and 94 FPS on the ASUS card, which is an impressive 11% improvement. So there are gains to be had depending on the game you play. So some pretty good numbers, but for the most part, the gains were as big as you'd expect, within a margin of each other. Sure, things may level out overall across multiple games when looking at the dips and the 1% lows, but that's about where it really ends. Now, the biggest point with custom AIB cards is going to come down to cooling performance, because that can open up extra headroom, not only for the likes of overclocking, but also for long-term gaming sessions where consistently running a longer boost can actually give better and more, let's say, glamorized figures overall. So with that in mind, it's time to take a look at the F123 1-hour stress test that we do on every card we look at. Right off the bat, we can see that the Gaming OC does a great job at taming the 4070 Super's core, with nice and cool temperatures at an average of around 61 degrees. The hotspot also managed to stay nicely cooled at just 71 degrees, whilst the memory temperature managed to sit even lower with an average of just 58 degrees, which I guess for the extra cost of this card is something that's very much welcomed. Now, with the temperatures of the card being pretty low, and with this being an overclock card, the clock speed manages to get a pretty decent jump over the MSRP 4070 Supers that we looked at yesterday, with the core clock on this card managing to sit just under 2,800 MHz. During all of this, the fan managed to stay, I guess, pretty quiet, running at around 1,775 RPM, whilst the card used no more than any other 4070 Super we looked at, with an average of just 218 watts. Moving over to the ASUS TUF Gaming, and this also managed to keep temperatures low, with a core temperature of just 61 degrees, whilst the hotspot sat around 70 degrees on average. The memory is the hottest part, around 72 degrees, but at that temperature, it's still nothing particularly warm for a GPU of this caliber. Now, in terms of the clock speeds, we see nothing unexpected with a high core clock of 2,750 MHz on average, so not as high as the Gigabyte, but still higher than the MSRP cards we looked at yesterday. The card consumed around 219 watts of power on average, whilst the fan barely span up, and only sat around 1,350 RPM throughout the test, meaning that you could easily bump the fan speed and see a lot of improvements in the already reasonable temperatures, and possibly even see a boost in the clock speeds. So cooling wise, there's definite improvements by getting a card like either the ASUS or the Gigabyte, with their much larger and more refined cooling solutions. And that does show in the performance we saw during the 1 hour long stress test. Now, it's also clear that, you do get much better quality materials over an MSRP card, with, I guess, the Founders being the one exception, because it is very industrious and made from mixed metals. The rest of the MSRP stack was more on the, let's say, plastic side. And that's where I feel that paying the extra, which for both of these cards will be about $50 to $80 more for either of them, and that is kind of where the cost itself actually goes, in the materials. So what I'm trying to say is there's no wall being pulled over your eyes or anything like that. You are actually getting an improved quality card, which not only looks and feels great, but allows extra gaming performance as seen in our charts, along with extra cooling performance as seen in F1. Now between the two, it's a tough one, but I think it's very close. And while I do prefer the look of the ASUS TUF, which I guess just feels slightly more premium for the most part, the Gigabyte is the better performer and is better at keeping things under control in terms of temperatures. But I also get that some people are very brand allegiant, so will buy ASUS because they have an ASUS motherboard and will want to fulfill that ecosystem of all of the same brand parts. Either way, you're not going to be disappointed with either of the cards. While the extra cost does mean it edges closer to the price of the 4070 Ti MSRP or the upcoming 4070 Ti Super MSRP, which are both at $799, it's still around $120 to $150 cheaper for a high-end SKU of the 4070 Super lineup, which I guess what I'm trying to say is enough of a gap. There's nothing worse when you're plagued with the decision of buying a high-end card of one series or a low-end card of the next GPU up in the stack, because there's only, pennies between them. Luckily, that's not the case here, and the performance is therefore about the right money. Though, as I said in my 4070 Super MSRP content, AMD in their 7800 XT could force NVIDIA to drop the price slightly, as the one big selling point NVIDIA have is DLSS. But even with the uptake on DLSS titles coming through thick and fast, not every game can utilize it yet. So there you go. That's about going to do it for this one. Let me know, ASUS or Gigabyte? Or would you rather have something cheaper in the MSRP space to get, let's say, 90% of the performance but for a lesser price? Let me know in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us through Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of cool goodies, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, access to all of our testing data, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.